Welcome to the Recombination Nation podcast. Today I am talking to Andiru, who has created a whole new auxiliary language. This is a kind of language that is intended to be accessible and useful for everybody and to unify all speakers on the planet. So it's kind of like a reverse Tower of Babel project, which I think makes it really admirable. And I think it's the kind of project whose time has come at this time in history. So before I carry on much more longer, I'll throw over to Andrew and he can tell us about his particular auxiliary language and how he kind of ended up on this path in life.
Hi, my name is Andiru. I create the language Baseyu as a international ex auxiliary language meant to unite people who speak multiple languages around the world and give them a common base language so they can understand each other even when they're traveling, for business, for travel, to connect with other people. And we don't really have an international auxiliary language. English comes close, but it has a number of difficulties that make it very hard for people in non-English adjacent countries to understand.
Yeah, yeah.
And there have been other attempts at international auxiliary language. The most famous, of course, is Esperanto, but has some European tendencies that make it difficult for it to be considered an international auxiliary language
Yeah, yeah.
instead of, a European one.
And well, I'm guessing
And
like Esperanto was kind of inspired by the age of trains and steamships, where people were traveling so much
hmm
more around the world and they were confronting more difficulties with communication, particularly in Europe, was kind of where that started. So it makes sense. Esperanto was a way of uniting European language speakers. But now in the digital
hmm
age, you can get on a Zoom call to almost anybody on the planet. And I mean, it's lovely that we have things like Google Translate for written language, and it does a pretty good job. It's pretty amazing.
exactly.
But if you actually want to talk to someone, acquiring a different language for like all the possible speakers out there, it's a huge
hmm
burden collectively. So yeah, I think that the idea is if there was one accessible, simple language that everybody could learn, then anybody can have a conversation, and that could be an amazing uh, a cultural tool that everybody can use. But I'm really interested to learn about you. So, what kind of
Absolutely.
person, like what kind of life journey gets you to the point where you're like, I'm going to invent a new language for the entire planet?
Yeah, so I had a lot of early experiences traveling around the world. I've known people who spoke seven, eight languages before, and I'm very impressed by that. And I know I'm a native English speaker, and I know maybe conversational Spanish. I could probably get through Mexico if I wanted to. But um but I looked at the international auxiliary languages that currently existed when I started in 2019,
Hmm.
and I wasn't entirely happy with the options they had at the time. And I looked at the attempts, and they either seemed too European or too complicated. And I thought, what if I went and tried to make an international auxiliary language that would unite people from around the world, and they wouldn't have to learn one language and
Yeah, yeah. Every time
lose
you go to a
self-connection?
different place. Yeah, no, no, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, gotcha.
So, have you always had this kind of instinct? Like, like, do you know when you first learned about Esperanto? Like, where did the idea that auxiliary languages are even a thing first get on your radar?
Yeah, I think it was around 2019, and I think it started as a hobby, an interesting hobby. I think I wanted to do something productive with my spare time and not like just video games or stuff like that, like something that could unite people and connect people. And I've seen how, you know, if we're around the world, we're not able to connect. We're not able to get the news from other countries. We're not able to connect with we're not able to connect to the media in other countries because we speak different languages,
Mm.
because we don't have, and I could see a language as a bridge to connect cultures, not to, eliminate languages and have just one language, but this would be auxiliary language that could connect people and they won't have to learn 7 or 8 languages just to travel the world or
Yeah,
do business or to connect with people.
yeah.
And we live in such a interconnected society now that it's becoming more of a necessity than it ever was. And some people say English has that place, but there's definitely limitations to English. And, you know, most of the world does not speak English. And that goes to show that we need a international auxiliary language that connects all these languages and takes inspiration from all of them
Yeah.
and can be a bridge. And in history, we've had Creoles, we've had Pidgins that have done that thing. So I was like, what if we had a Creole that took inspiration from, in my case, I said do the 15 most influential languages in the world, um, Mandarin Chinese, Hindi, English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Bengali, Persian, Arabic, Swahili, Indonesian, Filipino, and Japanese, German, and I believe, yes, I believe that's all.
Yeah.
And Russian.
If you're a little bit like me, do you feel sorry for people from other language backgrounds that they are kind of by default forced to learn English as this
Yes.
lingua franca? It's like it's such a messy language that's full of so many bits and pieces that it's like, how have we left this in such a mess in a state for so long?
Yes, and when it's something that you grow up with, you don't question it, but you when you're creating a new language, you kind of realize how many things we take for granted and how many things are just not common sense to not people overseas, but to even ourselves. It doesn't even seem common sense when you really look at it.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
just used to it.
Mm. Okay, so I put together a couple of notes and I wondered if we can do just a little tour of the history of auxiliary languages.
Hmm.
Because, like I said, they kind of started in the late 1800s. So
Hmm.
we'll kind of can both jump in and see if we have things we know about.
Absolutely.
So the first one that seems to have turned up is Volapük, or is it pronounced Volapük?
Afalapuk, I believe.
Yeah. So yeah, that one's I think the first one from like the mid to late 1800s.
Hmm.
And there was a
Hmm.
convention, there was a big convention in Paris in like
Hmm.
1889 with like all of the presentations were in this language. There were like
Hmm.
200 fluent speakers. But I think that was the convention that triggered a major split, that the person who originally came up with the system got undercut by someone else who revised the grammar, and like half the people said, "Yeah, we like the new grammar," and the original person said,
Hmm.
"No, it's only me that's allowed to change things," and it all became
Hmm.
like a slanging match. So yeah,
Yes.
there's a little hint of we'll talk about the dynamics of managing what is ultimately it becomes a collective uh,
Hmm.
community that engages in the language, but how does it change and evolve and adjust over time? That's a big problem. It's a coordination problem.
Yeah, it's a big discussion in the Auxlang and conlang community.
Mm.
Well, at what point does it become our language versus this person's language?
Yeah. And you know a little bit more about Esperanto. Do you want to tell us what you know about it?
Yeah, so the Dr. Esperanto, LL Zamenhof, he created Esperanto in the 18, I believe 1880s,
Mm.
1860s.
Mm.
Um, and it was he took inspiration from languages around him, German, Polish, Russian, Yiddish, and he saw that these different communities, they lived in the same city, but they couldn't communicate with each other. And he thought it was in many ways, it was very sad. And, those communities had trouble with each other, especially because they couldn't communicate. And um, it seemed unfair. And he came up with Esperanto. He took some ideas from Volapük. He said, let's not use the grammar from Latin. Let's use the vocabulary from Latin and have a new grammar that is simple and consistent. And he did do that. And it was very inspirational for the time.
I
But in many
believe
ways,
I believe the League of Nations was actually endorsing it at one point. The
Mm-hmm.
kind of proto-United Nations before World War II. Um, though I believe a couple of countries were deeply suspicious of it and pushed back. It was
Mm-hmm.
like banned in certain places at certain times.
Yes, it was, and especially after World War II and the Soviet Union, it kind of disconnected those communities. Though there are still speakers around the world, it's, the number is, it's very hard to say how many there actually are nowadays. And some of the reasons why it, you know, didn't spread as well as it could was somewhat political. It was also somewhat the limitations of the language. Even for that time, it was a very agglutinative language. It was like German, where you would add words onto each other.
Mm,
And most languages around the world are non-agglutinative, so that's kind of a weird concept for a lot of people to wrap their mind around,
mm,
even though it was consistent. Um, the thing that I always struggled with in um, when learning Spanish was verb conjugation. And Esperanto has its own similarly convoluted system of verb conjugation that was not a benefit for new learners, especially people who speak analytical languages, and that means like using particles. In Spanish, you'd say we are, you'd say estamos or vamos. But that's to go.
mm.
But in English, you would say we go.
Yeah,
You wouldn't, there's no conjugation there because
yeah,
English is more of an analytical language. Mandarin, Indonesian, very analytical languages, and they are a lot simpler. It's very hard for people living in China, Indonesia, and these kind of languages to understand European synthetic languages
yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
even agglutinative ones.
Yeah, and I believe Esperanto had its own split. A reformed
Mm-hmm.
version called Edo broke off in the early 1900s, but then
Mm-hmm.
just as it was getting momentum, its founder died, and then a
Mm-hmm.
co-founder decided to create yet another language, and Edo kind of died out. So again, there's that dynamic of cultures splitting, which is
Yes, and that
dangerous.
that continued on.
Um, and there's a couple of other ones. There's interlinguer and interlingua,
Mm-hmm.
which are
Mm-hmm.
fairly different, even though the names being quite similar.
Right.
Um, and they kind of came around the time of World War II, but then got interrupted by the war. Um,
Right. Yeah, it was made in 1950s by, I believe, a wealthy heiress. I
mhm,
can't remember the name. Um, but she used her money to create an organization called I believe it was the World Language Society. It was something along those lines, and it was to create the perfect language. And they kind of took the same methodology as Esperanto and used mostly Latin words and compared them to the modern languages and English and the loanings around the world and said, well, everyone kind of speaks Latin, so let's make basically a Latin language. And when we use that methodology on a limited subset, you basically get a reformed Latin language.
yeah.
And for the last century, pretty much all of them have been a reformed form of Latin in the Auxlang world.
Mm, mm. There's also
Um,
inter-Slavic is a recent
hmm
movement because there's so
very
many
recent.
almost mutually uninterpretable variations of Slavic languages
Hmm
that all live right next to each other, and people have
hmm
started moving around so much more in that region. And yeah,
Absolutely.
that's mostly been in the 2000s, but apparently that uh, idea goes way back to the 1600s that they thought, wouldn't it
Hmm
be great if we could talk to our neighbors instead of declaring war every 5 minutes over misunderstandings?
Absolutely. And that's an example of a regional auxiliary language. Um, Another good example would be modern standard Arabic. There's the different Arabic varieties, but most of them understand modern standard Arabic at school
Hmm.
and in official documentation and newspapers. That's the language that they hear, but they speak their own dialect of Arabic at home and in their day-to-day lives.
I mean, I guess it's a general point that as technology changes, um, the demands that are put on language changes as well. Like if you want to coordinate a bigger country and use lots of paperwork, you need some kind
Hmm.
of form of language in that paperwork that everyone can understand, even if there's regional variations in language historically.
Absolutely.
And
And yeah,
beyond
and
that, now
the
we've got digital tools, and people are trying to communicate across the entire globe. So it feels like the time has
hmm
arrived for an Auxlang to finally break through.
Yeah, exactly. Like this idea of having a simple language that everyone can understand, especially for nations, is not a new thing. Like standard Italian was a dialect of Florence of in the 1600s, and now is the standard Italian dialect that most Italians speak now. But that was not the case. Only about 3% of Italians understood Italian when Italy first formed.
Mm. That's very similar to the Philippines with Tagalog
Hmm.
as their
Hmm.
official government language. It's just one of many regional languages that they just kind of
Yes.
decided. Yeah, it's interesting
Hmm.
how that unfolds. Now, another really interesting recent thing that's kind of exploded onto the conlanging scene is Tokipona. And
Hmm.
do you want to tell people a little bit about what it is in case they're not kind of familiar with the this part of the world?
Yeah, Tokipona was experimental language. Some people argue or not, it is a Auxlang, internet IAL, International Auxiliary Language, but it is a very simple language. It has about 130, 120, 130 words, and you can use them in different ways, and each word has a lot of different meanings, so it's more of a mental exercise to understand the way languages work. You could combine two words and they create a new word, and then you could so on and so forth.
Mm.
And when you're explaining simple concepts, you only need, a few words to communicate.
I think that the extremely small size of its word
Mm-hmm.
set has made it really appealing. Like it's part of the barrier to entry. Like if you're looking at I want to learn French, there's like
Mm-hmm.
there's potentially tens of thousands of words that you could learn
Yes.
before you feel like you're an expert, and at least several
Mm-hmm.
thousand before you feel you have basic fluency. But that
Mm-hmm.
idea of such a low barrier to entry, you only have to like memorize 137 words, I think is the higher range of the official word list. And that's it.
Yes.
Like you're finished. There's not a never-ending horizon of more fancy words that you can learn. You're done.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, Sonya Lang just came out with a book actually to explain more of Tokipona and word combinations and how the grammar works. The grammar is very simple. It's also, example of a isolating language where you use particles to explain, where this is a noun or a verb or where this is a subject or the object.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a very interesting experiment, and I do have someone
Hmm.
else lined up to interview who is up to the neck in the Tokipona and Esperanto community.
Right,
So we
right.
won't delve into it too much, but I think it's just interesting to
No,
touch
no.
on it.
And actually, Baseyu was inspired by Tokipona, actually,
Mm,
um, inspired by the simplicity of Tokipona, and that was really my starting point of having a super simple language. Baseyu is the only Auxlang currently that is CVC, which just means there's a consonant, an optional initial consonant, a vowel, and an optional initial consonant. So you wouldn't have um, digraphs, which is like, tree, there's TR is
yeah,
one sound, tree.
yeah.
You wouldn't have that in Baseyu and make it simpler because there are a lot of digraphs that are very specific to Europe and ones that are specific to Africa and ones that
Hmm.
are specific to Asia. And when you take away that, and make sure they're highly simple words that um, makes it a lot easier for people from varying different countries to understand the words and not have to learn a bunch of new sounds instead of learning the 25 words that are in Baseyu, the 25 sounds, you have to learn multiple combinations of sounds as well to learn English or any European language.
Yeah, and a lot of though, like there's so many interesting, peculiar sounds in native languages that are a
Hmm.
challenge to produce with your
Yes.
mouth if you haven't grown up learning to make that sound.
Hmm.
That can be a huge barrier. I mean, probably French is one of the most common. It's one of the
Hmm.
big languages that people from outside of French have a challenge getting certain uh,
Hmm.
mouth movements right. Um, I mean, you can kind of muddle along and sound like a foreigner, but
Right. And in a way, if everyone's starting from the same base of we don't really know this language, you don't have that higher, superiority in language. It really takes out that hierarchy within language where, well, you don't speak this well, so you are excluded.
yeah, yeah. Are there any other auxiliary languages in the scene today that you think are noteworthy?
Interlingua, I do think their comparative method was very influential and I used that, but it was just on such a limited subset of languages, English and the Latin languages, that it wasn't able to come up with the results they were hoping for.
Mm,
What I did with Baseyu is to expand that set of languages to, international languages and looking for the most common word instead of a word that only really exists in one language.
mm, mm.
I looked for the commonalities instead of the specific words that were, only, you can't find the word dog in other languages, um, in the major world languages.
Yeah.
It's only in English.
What do you think is the main defining feature that separates auxiliary languages from just constructed languages, conlangs? Because I think there's probably like 100 conlangs for every Auxlang out there.
Yeah, so those are more artistic endeavors, a lot of times philosophical endeavors, seeking to understand the limits of language,
Mm.
um, thinking of how, an alien society you might think of language. There's the Na'vi or the Klingon that you hear a lot of the time. There are, probably the most common conlang today is probably Minionese from the Minions movie.
Oh,
Everyone's familiar with it, but they have no idea what it is, and it's probably the most well known, even though no one knows it.
I love that. I love that. Now, another thing that could be interesting too is just to reflect on the size of various Auxlang communities out there. And as you said before, it's really difficult to like nail down a number because
Hmm.
for every like fluent speaker, or even like a person who in some cases grew up speaking a language like as almost their
Hmm.
first language, I think there's a few Esperanto people who were raised as children speaking Esperanto
Yes.
first, which is an
Yes.
interesting thing to do to your children. Well, they probably learnt multiple languages, but
Right.
I've seen estimates anywhere from 200,000 to 2 million for Esperanto.
Hmm.
So by
Hmm.
that metric, it's probably one of the more successful one. And Tokipona, it's weird. It has a very large internet presence, but I've seen
Hmm.
estimates as low as 2,000 people who are fluent speakers. And I wonder if those
Right.
figures are maybe out of date, that it could be experiencing a sudden upswing in popularity.
Well, especially because it's such a new language, the idea of fluency is kind of, nebulous to
Hmm.
a lot of us.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of people have in the Vyasa interview I heard, basically the mentality is if you can understand it, it's language.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're speaking Tokipona to someone, they understand you, you're speaking Tokipona.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Not of, well, you don't know enough Tokipona, so you're not a real Tokiponist.
Hmm. Um, Now, what lessons do you think Auxlangers can take from past successes, for example, in Tokipona or Viosa, like we just mentioned?
Well, yeah, I think creators of a language need to, there have been attempts to make, languages from a group. A lot of times those kind of tend to fall away because no one really takes ownership over it, and they don't really, no one puts the effort in if they don't feel a sense of ownership in it.
Hmm.
And then there's creators who take such a high sense of ownership that they want to control every minute detail as the language naturally progresses. And I think a creator needs to, at some point let go of the reins to an extent and let it be a language for the people who speak it.
Mm. I think that's where Tokipona has a huge advantage in being so
Hmm.
small that it could be
Hmm.
controlled by one person to the degree that it has, and it has a very clear boundary about where it ends.
Hmm.
Have you run into issues with that with Baseyu? Like, have you decided to make a clear limit to the number of words that you are putting in the official set?
It's gone through so many iterations that, I haven't had that problem because I've been putting it through iterations. I think I'm finally at a point where I'm happy enough with it that I will have, quite soon an official Baseyu dictionary and it won't be touched for a period of time. And
Mm,
well, at least the core words will not change, but you can still add words to it. I think
mm,
the number of root words in Baseyu is about 1,400,
hmm.
and the total words is about 10,700.
Yeah. And that 15 odd hundred is something that is uh it's approachable as someone thinking
Hmm.
about getting started. They've got a
Right.
goal to get to. With acquisition of this language, have you thought ahead to any way of segmenting those 1500 words into smaller sets that can be taken on one at a time, or is that a problem for another day?
Yes. Yes, I do. There are a number of apps for making flashcards.
Hmm.
And I already have it listed, all the root words and their origins listed in a separate document that I have posted. I'm still working on some kinks with the website, but the dictionary's up.
Hmm.
The dictionary is working fine. Um, and I was like a set of flashcards I'm gonna make. I believe there's something called Anki decks, which I'm going to use to make a flashcards for all the root words that people can learn, and it'll be a lot easier to get into the language once you understand the root words. And I suggest people to learn the root words first to get an idea of the language before they jump into things like grammar and other concepts.
Do you think there's any possibility for an Auxlang like Baseyu to be acquired through a creolization rather than like a clean break between the native language and the Auxlang?
Well, whatever people who first take on Baseyu, who start to learn it, it might become very popular. In Korea, for example, it might develop some level of Korean flair,
Mm,
or in Nigeria, it might become very well used. It might develop a lot of Nigerian flair.
mm,
It's going to be influenced by the people who speak it. And then at some point, there's going to be people who speak it over here and people over here that speak it a little bit differently.
mm,
And they will have to find some way to come together and agree on what is Baseyu.
mm. Do you think the use of the language in um, artistic products like podcasts and movies and all those kind of things that get people engaged in using the language could have a really critical role in maintaining the cohesion of the language.
Absolutely, they would. And, you develop some level of culture, whether it be international culture, the culture of traveling, whether, it'd be used, when we first go to space, like what language are they going to speak? Maybe they'll speak Baseyu, it's
Mm,
going to develop some level of culture in whatever spaces it finds itself in.
mm. Uh, Here's a kind of odd question, but the aesthetics of the language, what flavor or what influence do you think that puts? Like, I mean, we have this stereotype that like German is such an angry language. It
Mm,
isn't really if you look closer, but people like to play with it, and that French is kind of slimy and flowery. Like,
mm.
how does aiming to create a an accessible language from multiple kinds of cultural origins, how does that work aesthetically when it all intersects?
Right. So yeah, this is the problem that some worldlings have come into, where it in some ways sounds like a mishmash of multiple different languages.
Mm,
And I feel like when you put some level of restriction on the phonology, on the grammar, on the word set, the letter set, you do have, a similar feel. And I feel like Baseyu, when I put it into a translation, it'll either say it looks Indonesian or it looks Portuguese or Spanish,
Mm,
depending on, the sentence. And, you know, it, I think the goal for Baseyu is to speak clearly. You
mm,
speak each syllable with clarity and with focus, and there's no so it is considered a syllable timed language, which means each syllable gets the same amount of emphasis.
hmm.
So, you're saying Baseyu, how do you say it? It's not but Baseyu, it's Baseyu.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Each
yeah.
each syllable gets the same level of emphasis.
Hmm, hmm.
And you want to speak clearly and you focus on getting those syllables be clear, similar to, Japanese or, the Nigerian languages like
Hmm.
Igbo, Yoruba. Those are tonal languages that have a different, um, but they speak it very clearly. They speak, and that's the accent I am somewhat inspired by. I don't want to say, oh, you have to speak it with a Nigerian accent, but I say, Baseyu.
Mm,
You want to speak clearly and focused, and maybe a little bit from the throat
hmm, hmm. Yeah, it's
or the diaphragm.
I'm a filthy monolingual, so all of this stuff, getting my head around it and
Yeah.
getting that flexibility is, well, my first second language, I want to be one for life. Like I want to pick exactly the right one, and then it's like this is the one I'm going to learn.
Yeah.
One day, one day. And I want to revisit this idea that a language like this in practice on a bigger scale could spread and be acquired by infiltrating other native languages.
Hmm.
English, for example, is notorious for picking up other words from other languages and just making them part of English. And I wonder if
Hmm.
that kind of mode of propagation could be something that works. Uh, Almost like on the internet, like, oh, this is the word of the week,
Hmm.
this is the meme of the week. We're all going to start
Yeah.
using a Baseyo word for something rather than our own native languages. And little by little,
Yeah.
without having to like sit down and study and like pass tests,
Hmm.
we can
Hmm.
start building the tools for communication. And at some
Hmm.
point, you could just, without doing any homework, get on a Zoom call to someone in Japan and have a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's you can have it be slang. You use that as slang. You can use it, maybe to confuse your parents. Like,
Hmm,
oh, I don't want my mom to know what I'm saying, so I'm going to talk in Baseyu instead of, some people use Pig Latin.
hmm, hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's just a really interesting part of the cultural dynamic that it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Oh, the other thing I'm always curious about, do you think that a sign language could ever emerge as an Auxlang? Because
Well,
it's like it's kind of it's so different to how most people communicate that everyone is kind of starting from nothing, learning how to sign.
hmm. Well, there are different national sign languages. There's
Mm,
different sign types of sign language used in every country. Even countries that speak the same language, they might have a different sign language
mm,
with, varying degrees of being the same. Um, I think sign language definitely could be useful. Um, and it is another example of a artificial language that was created and was able to be spread around the world in a very quick time.
mm, mm. Yeah, and yeah, I think particularly with technology, like a video call these days is almost as accessible as a plain voice call. So
Hmm.
yeah, I wonder if that, and that could be potentially a way of getting around accents and like strengths and weaknesses in people's vocal capacity,
Hmm.
that it could
Yeah,
kind of
and
be a
you could
fallback.
even use sign language to enhance your speaking of an international language. It doesn't have to be
Hmm,
um, all spoken,
mm, mm. Yeah, it's just anyway, it's an interesting topic that my mind keeps wondering about. Okay, so
right?
I want to dig into Baseyu in a little bit more detail. So,
Hmm.
Do you want to describe a little bit more about your decision-making process in like laying the foundations? What your like most core principles that kind of got you started?
hmm So, so, um, so using the comparative method to look at, oh, so we take these 15 main languages that are in Baseyu and look at, oh, there's two cognates. So in languages, there's something called a cognate. So, in English, you have restaurant, but in Spanish, you have restaurante. And those are considered cognates because they sound pretty similar and they come from the same root.
Hmm.
And you can, when you're learning a new language that's adjacent to yours, you pick up on the cognates very quickly.
Hmm.
And I think, in where I live in Arizona, we speak a lot of Spanglish. You can pick up on a lot of things from Spanish by, noticing the cognates, and you know that you can have some of a conversation even with someone who speaks no English by using the little bit of Spanish and the little bit of English they know.
Hmm. Hmm. So yeah, looking for those natural bridge points.
hmm
Yeah, yeah. And how does that work with really different languages like Mandarin?
Right. So that could work with using simple grammar tendencies. Um, so Mandarin and English both have this thing called nominalization and verbing, which is where a noun can be used as a verb and a verb can be used as a noun.
Hmm.
And that was something I incorporated into Baseyu, and it's a very simple thing. So there's more just grammatical tendencies that
Hmm.
you could use when these languages are not super similar, but you can find a way to make it um, equally understandable for everyone.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then, but say it uses a limited number of affixes. So, like how you'd say um, rethink instead of think, you rethink it because you have that affix re beforehand,
Hmm.
and you are inventing a new word without having a completely different word that sounds nothing like think.
Hmm. Yeah, it's segmenting those concepts so there's some
hmm
flexibility, and you get like a
hmm
combinatorial explosion. Like if you've got 30 of various pieces you can put together, you can multiply them into multiple, there's so many more combinations that you can creatively
Yes.
put together. Yeah.
Yes, and a lot of languages, a lot of Auxlang Esperanto is agglutinative because it did that to such a high extent that sometimes you couldn't even notice the root words. And in Baseyu, I said make it more isolating. So it does have some of that where it makes sense in a common sense way,
Mm,
but not if you limit it to about 35 affixes in Baseyu, you don't have that go on, 5 words deep.
mm. I'm also really curious, like a lot of people doing conlanging start with a set of sounds.
hmm
And I know Toki Pona pared that right down to kind of like the smaller set that is the most accessible to the rest of the world. And I think that has advantages as well with
hmm
technology. Like we're mostly using typewriters that are designed for
hmm
English, and we have a set of letters at our disposal. So I'm wondering how that worked for Baseyu.
Yes, originally I tried to keep it down to 15 letters. Originally the concept was, what if Tokipono was an international auxiliary language? And it did have only about 15 letters, and I kept working with it. At some point, I got up to about 17 letters, and then I realized, yes, this is a very cool concept, but at the same time, it limited my ability to loan words from other languages without making them unrecognizable.
Hmm. Hmm.
So if I wanted to loan Deutschland, I'd have to make it Deutschlanda.
Hmm.
And, someone might not be able to recognize that because I simplified it so much that it became unrecognizable.
Hmm.
So originally I did try to do that, but then eventually I decided to, with Baseyu, add more letters, but I certainly use those less common letters far less than, the very simple letters in Baseyu. You can still
Yeah.
see some of that original influence
Yeah.
in the language.
Now, English is notorious for its diphthongs. This is where you like string
Hmm.
different vowel sounds together, whereas a lot of other languages like Spanish, they're quite rare. I think does Japanese use them? Um, I don't know the Japanese very well. I think they avoid them. They use them a lot less than English
Yes.
does. Yeah.
There's something called a mora where they say the two vowels. You can have two vowels right next to each other, but you pronounce them separately.
Yeah. They're not slid together. There's a
Hmm.
punctuation. And yeah, I wonder how did you approach dealing with diphthongs in Baseyu?
Well, so the vowels in Baseyu are the same ones used in Japanese, the five vowel system, A, E, I, O, U,
Hmm.
and they're the same versions of those that you'd find in Spanish. And Japanese is also, uses something similar to that. I think they do have they use the long I as well,
Hmm.
towards like you see the AI, they'll use the long I. But in Baseyu, I also have no diphthongs. I just use, you can say the two vowels next to each other, but you pronounce them separately. So instead of I, you say IE. Instead
Hmm.
of eo, you say eo.
Yeah.
If you say like, and in English, we have, I think almost 26 diphthongs
Yeah, it's crazy.
sounds.
It's crazy.
And, to a speaker of a language that has, maybe five vowel sounds, that seems, crazy to them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an experiment I want to try doing one day because I learnt that I think ancient Greece and ancient Persian went through a government-driven monothongization. So they used to
Mm.
have lots of complex diphthongs, and they just decided to get rid of them at some point in their history to make the
Oh,
language simpler. And I would love
wow.
to see what English sounds like using like a text-to-speech program to like take
Hmm.
a fairly ordinary chunk of language and like squeeze out all of the diphthongs, like using some
Hmm.
fairly consistent rule, like you have to make decisions about how to simplify them. But yeah,
Hmm.
how would that sound? And would it sound similar to some dialect of English? Because there's lots of regional like tweaks in the vowels in
Yeah.
English. It's something I have to put on my list to do.
Yeah, and that's the problem with English is all attempts to, make English simpler, make basic English. It kind of runs into the same problem with English is that it is such a hierarchical language where if you don't speak it correctly, you're seen as lesser in some way or not as less intelligent or less trustworthy because you have to speak it the proper way, either the American standard or the British standard or the
Hmm.
Australian standard way of speaking it.
Do, do you think, well, this is more a cultural thing, but I want to talk about it now. Um, do you think teenagers are like the ideal target for picking up Auxlangs? That they have the mental flexibility, they have the tendency to
Hmm.
form subcultures, and like you said, they have an incentive to want to be able to speak in a way that the adults don't know exactly what they're up to.
Yes.
Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely, and I've seen that. Yeah, there are teenagers in the Baseyu community that are, very active and they have the free time to learn, and that's before your brain's fully developed, you can learn languages a lot easier.
Mm. And I guess they're more chronically online as well too. So
Yes.
if it becomes a digital lingua franca, then they're kind of at
Hmm.
the leading edge of that. Hmm. Um,
Yeah, and
I have another question too. How do you weigh up the pros and cons of deriving a language from other languages versus just starting from scratch? I believed with Toki Pona, she basically just picked what the words were
hmm.
based on vibes. Is that not, does that scale? Uh, is it hard to scale that to a larger word set? Like you get exhausted, like having to make
Yes.
up words when you've got that many to have to nail down.
I think, there's a level of like, okay, you try to find the most common word and you do all these things and you could get it perfectly, but then the word just sounds funny.
Yeah.
to you, to anyone else. It might sound like a curse word in another language, and you're like, oh, I don't want to do that specifically, even though at some point you're going to have, similar words to other languages word. That's going to exist to some extent.
Mm,
Um, but at some point you just have to use vibes at the end of the day when you've used every methodology you have to, have a word that people are going to use.
mm,
Otherwise, it gets replaced. That's what we do when a word doesn't sound right. We just end up replacing it with a different word.
mm. A, a related question, when you create a new language like this, does the culture have like this rare opportunity for new forms of comedy? Because so a lot of comedy is based around wordplay. Like the Japanese have
Mm-hmm.
these all of these puns that only work in
Mm-hmm.
Japanese that they love
Mm-hmm.
collectively. When you create a new language, there's no way you could like guess what all of those funny connections are
Yeah.
going to be. And has that started to like crop up in the people who are learning Baseyu?
I think yeah, there's some like, tendency to make fun of, when I say, "Hey, this is the new word for this," and they're like, "That kind of sounds like, this, insult in this language." I'm like, "Okay, maybe I shouldn't use that word." I think
Uh,
when I changed the original name of Baseyu was Jita-sama, and when I changed, the J sound to the SH, added the SH sound, then the language became Shita-sama, and I'm like, oh, I can't use that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I'm also interested on your thoughts about centralized control because the community is
Hmm.
still new enough and small enough that you are very
Hmm.
much at the crossroads of like making those decisions,
Hmm. Hmm.
versus decentralized evolution and like even the transition and the fuzzy edges between those like extremes. Like how do
Hmm.
you think that's going to play out and just generally in terms of like strategizing language creation?
I personally am very happy to take some of the reins off because it is a lot of work to
Mm,
make all those words and to make it perfect in my eyes. And at the end of the day, it's not going to be just because I wanted to get off the ground enough that, people will actually speak it and then start to make those changes themselves. If they want to change the grammar, if they want to do it this way, then I'd be happy to modify it to a certain level. But if all the literature and books have to keep rewriting and rewriting and rewriting, that would
mm.
become a hassle. And, it'd be difficult for the people learning the language to have to relearn it with me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, a related
So,
question is like how do you think an Auxlang can maintain cohesion over time and
hmm.
space? And are you expecting that Baseyu is going to diffuse and fragment as it gains popularity?
Well, yes, it can diffuse and fragment, but it can also, reconvene as well. You see that with, British English is now becoming more like American English, and Americans are speaking with, are watching Bluey all the time, and now we're speaking. Our kids are sound a little bit Australian sometimes.
I mean that I think you hit the nail on the head. It's ultimately about maintaining contact between the
Hmm.
speakers, and
Hmm.
the internet is the perfect tool for doing that today.
It is.
And that's why I think that's the real challenge is finding a culture like a lived culture that
Hmm.
encourages people to speak to people from other language backgrounds in this language on a
Hmm.
regular basis. Don't form little ghettos of
Yes.
Indonesian Baseyu speakers who only speak to Indonesian
Hmm.
Baseyu speakers.
Hmm.
So yeah, I wonder if you have any dreams or hopes of how that culture, like even just like, one day a week, you call some random person on Zoom
Hmm.
from the other side of the planet and talk to them.
Well, I think news is very important. I think we like and maybe if there was a newspaper, online
Hmm.
newspaper in Baseyu, that would be really influential in bringing people together and, talking not just about Baseyu news, but news around the world. I think that would be very important. I think online chat rooms, very good. Um, I think, I probably am the most active on Discord. I mean, Discord has been useful, but it can be a little bit isolating. So I definitely want to spread out and have it connected in other social media platforms. And people should convene and have Baseyu conferences one day, hopefully.
Mm. What about I think of like the cultural impact of things like Sesame Street in getting language to the people who are most receptive to absorbing it.
Hmm.
Like basically the younger you can start, the easier. And I wonder if you've thought about any avenues for like a, well, like you said with Bluey, like influencing children's
Hmm.
accents. Could
Yeah,
a YouTube channel be for teaching Baseyu to children?
absolutely. That would be very good. I've started writing children's books in Baseyu.
Hmm.
Like the Three Little Pigs and Baseyu and different children's books are good. Even for, adult speakers, that's simple words that, you can understand and you can get started with. If you're learning, you know, Spanish, you're not going to start with Spanish Shakespeare.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's
Actually,
an
there is
advantage because the
some,
parents would be learning it at the same time as their children. It's something they could do together.
absolutely. The first book I actually translated into Baseyu is actually the Tao Te Ching,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is a pretty, short book. It's about 80 pages, and the pages are not very long. And it does work with some very, philosophical concepts, but it also was a way to show that, let's say you can um, translate, poetic and philosophical language in a way that is understandable.
Hmm. 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 Um, Now, well, a related question: what do you see as the barriers to uptake for Auxlangs? Like, what if a person is just thinking about getting into it? Like, what gets in the way of them actually committing and taking the dive and getting up and running with a new language?
I mean, maybe to some extent, like social stigma. You're speaking a weird language, someone might, look at that as odd. Um, Also, the prevalence of English, people say, why don't you just learn English? Why don't you
Mm,
just speak in English? That could be a barrier, but now we're seeing, the waning of English. English is like very solitary influence on the world. What language will replace it? French used to be the global lingua franca,
mm,
but got replaced by English. And I don't think any one language in the world is in the place to, replace English, but
mm.
maybe a international auxiliary language, it's the perfect time for.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the perfect
It
time for it for the world.
you've got me really thinking because most human behavior is motivated by uh, perceptions of status.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like fashion. Like why are you buying that particular brand of jeans or shoes?
Mm-hmm.
It's because you want to be seen in a particular way. And I think that's going to be a
Absolutely.
key thing for an Auxlang. To
Mm-hmm.
there has to be some kind of payoff to be seen to have
Mm-hmm.
mastered or at least start to tackle that language. And yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a really interesting thing to consider as you push the project forward. It's like
Um,
what social benefits do people get when they say, "Oh, I'm learning Baseyu"?
yeah,
How are their
and
friends
and
going to react?
absolutely expanding it not to just, I think I'm someone limited by the English speaking community because I speak English, and expanding it past the English speaking community to people from people of all walks of life and around the world, and it having some tangible value either in business, English is the language of business, maybe it could replace it one day.
Mm,
It could be the language of travel, and if status-wise it seems as a way of like, hey, we're both on the same level, that could be a good way of showing that status. So like we're both on the same level, we're both trying to connect with each other in a way.
mm. I mean, I could almost see it tapping into a signal of cultural humility as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of it's a concession to everyone on the planet. Like it's a olive branch
Very well put.
to reach out. Yeah, yeah. I don't know. Other thing I really wanted to talk about too is how could you see the combination of the internet and emerging digital technologies lowering the barriers to get people like started and up to speed with a new language?
I think, either we're at the point where we don't need an international auxiliary language because translation technology has become so advanced they could literally do text to speech,
Mm,
or it's at the point where, you know, uh, being able to learn a language is so easy because you don't have to rely on $200 textbooks and having, a college degree to learn a language.
mm,
You know, while Baseyu is, not widely spoken, it's very easy to learn.
mm.
I think, some estimates that you could learn Esperanto in 6 months. I think you could do the same with Baseyu if you put maybe an hour a day into it, you could learn it in 6 months.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And that's actually pretty conservative. I think you could probably do it sooner for a lot of people that are more into languages, and because Baseyu has a lot of influence from a lot of languages. If you are already um, bilingual, if you're already bilingual, then if you spoke Chinese, Indonesian, and English, you know about 75% of the root words in Baseyu already.
Mm, mm. Is there a this is something I'm grappling with. When you're trying to speak, how do you restrict yourself to a set of words from just one official language? Or is there always a danger of like throwing in English words when, yeah, like how do you maintain the barriers between languages and
Uh,
not fall into a Creole?
I think, code switching is a part of natural language, and there's like this idea of switching from, English to Spanish, or maybe a higher register of English to a lower register of English to speak to
Mm,
someone in your local community who speaks like maybe a accent or a dialect of yours.
yeah,
I do that. I'm from the rural area of Arizona. Whenever I hear someone with a little rural twang, I'm like, I kind of go back to that
yeah,
a little
yeah,
bit
yeah, 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 yeah.
to connect with them. And what was the original question again?
Oh, just about like how do you maintain a barrier between an Auxlang and other words kind of bleeding in, or is that okay? Is that
That's fine.
that's a part of natural language?
Yeah, it's a natural part of language, and it helps you communicate. If words get added in as it's spoken, then that's just part of it, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah. Okay, I'm probably being overly paranoid about that.
No, no,
Um,
that's fine. That's a great question.
Mm. Now, I'm also really interested to get your reflections on what it's been like building a community around this Auxlang. Like you're kind of the nucleus. Like, how did you find people?
Hmm.
How did you convince them? What were the early adopters like versus the later ones? Like, how does that
Hmm.
whole dynamic work?
Well, a lot of it's been on Discord lately because that's where, the Auxlang community right now is the most active. And, a lot of my work with them is because a lot of them also are Auxlangers. I connect with them, I show my ideas. They give me, sometimes very strong feedback, which I have to be like, oh, maybe I should change that
Mm,
to make it more like the other languages. And but at the same time, I enjoy that because I think the say you got better because I shared my ideas, and even the ones that were a little bit out there and well to understand language better.
mm.
And with the people that are learning Baseyu, yeah, they come up with ideas for Baseyu. I think I changed one thing recently because someone suggested it. And I'm like, yeah, that's a really good idea. I'll add that in.
I mean, as
So
the
they're
founder,
active.
you've got a balancing act. You could be absolute dictator and say no,
Hmm.
it's all take it or leave it, and you'd potentially lose people for that. Or you could be too accommodating, and then there's no stability. So yeah,
Yeah.
striking a balance must be an interesting a challenge.
Yeah, I definitely am coming near to a point where I want to have a strong line of this is what Baseyu is,
Hmm.
this is the grammar, this is the language, the core words, but you can, add these other words in. And I think, you know, if it does ever have that change, I'm willing to change with it because I want it to have a community and an active community at that.
Is this kind of project a little bit like the new tech adoption bubble wave that you get like a very small number of early adopters whose motivation is different to the next wave of people that jump on, and then eventually when it becomes widestream, like mainstream, and many people are doing it, the dynamic changes again that you have to kind of navigate those phases successfully.
I absolutely agree with that because language is probably the earliest form of technology we have.
Mm,
And the fact that we just let it happen naturally is both, useful, but we could, in some ways reinvent the wheel and do something new that makes it easier for everyone to understand. And in a way, this is a technology, and you get people involved, and they have to, invest their resources, which is usually time and energy, to learn the language. And there's a payback where you can communicate with people.
yeah, absolutely. So what have you got a sense of like what phase you're up to? Like what different kind of people you're trying to draw into the project next to get to the next stage of growth? Because it sounds like
Yeah.
you've had a core of like really dedicated Auxlangers who already have
Hmm.
some experience and want to support
Hmm.
you making Baseyu as good as possible. But like,
Hmm.
yeah, what's the next phase that you're kind of moving into?
I think a lot of them also have that like hobby of like liking languages so much they want to create their own Auxlang, whether or not they wanted to have the same um the aspirations I have, they maybe just want it for themselves or for their friends or family in the way that people treat conlangs.
Mm.
But I think there's very dedicated people in the community, and I think, you know, I want the language to expand, and and they can be the people to teach the next generation of people that come in. They can, help build upon the concepts that I have instilled in the community.
One possibility I've wondered too for natural acquisition without having to like study is if you could like redub movies in a language.
Hmm.
And if it's a movie that people love rewatching, like they already know every line, they understand what the content of the speech is, like they've memorized that,
Hmm.
you could put a new language and Auxlang on top of that. And you get to enjoy a movie that you're going to watch another 20 times in your life because you love it so much.
Hmm.
But you can like pick up a new language at the same time. And technology feels like it's getting close to being able to do that at a high quality, like the text to
Oh,
speech
you're right.
engines. Yeah.
Hmm. You're absolutely right, and that's kind of like the, probably the biggest problem with people learning Auxlang is there's no culture,
Hmm.
or real like media attached to it. And I've tried to make some media, some songs, some media in Baseyu. I have to, as the language evolves, I have to re-update the vocabulary.
So, Andiru, it's been amazing talking to you. Where can people learn more about what you're doing, get involved? What kind of links? I'll put it all in the show notes so people can find you easily.
Hmm. So there's the Reddit, Baseyu Reddit. There is the online dictionary, dictionary.baseyu.net. There is the Discord server. Um, and that's probably where I'm most active right now. There's also Blue Sky. And if you want to become part of the community and learn about a new language and learn to speak with people, we would love to have you.
Excellent, excellent. And yeah, you need artists. You need people to put it into
Hmm.
motion and
Absolutely.
yeah, sprinkle a bit of sugar on top and give people an incentive to get
Hmm.
involved. And yeah, I'm very tempted that I think I'm gonna start learning this language. I think it's one that
Oh,
has convinced me, yes.
fantastic.
Oh, and you mentioned as well, you've have you recorded any like examples of the language spoken that people can actually hear? Uh,
Yes, just certain sentences, but probably learning the literature like the translated Tao Te Ching, having that, reading that would definitely be good, and I eventually want to have an audio recording of that as well.
yeah. That actually might be where I get involved because I'm
Hmm.
a real fan of text to speech, and it'd be really
Mm.
interesting to see how it handles Baseyu, and
That would be
to
great.
yeah, and then yeah, I want to play around with that technology again. So yeah, sign me up for that. Okay, well, Andrew, thank you very much for taking the time to talk, and this has been fascinating, and I love exploring these kind of cultural experiments, building new tools
Mhm.
that change the way that people interact over the entire planet. So, yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
If you'd like to read more of my work, you can sign up for free to Recombination Nation at Substack. You'll get a weekly reminder of every post in the first week that it's out. After that, posts go behind the paywall for paid subscribers. So grab a paid subscription if you want to support all the work that I'm doing here on my lonesome. Next week, I talk to Glenn Roberts about all his lifetime of amazing work reviving heritage staple crops in his part of the United States and how he started a milling company to bring them back to consumers.